Just a little bit about the podcast. First, as an immigrant to the U.S., I always found there not just as an immigrant, just as a musician, I guess I always found things that were upsetting or bothered me in classical music world, because I was classically trained. I just recently actually finished my doctorate here at University of Washington, and no, I just going through this whole process, I found there are a lot of things that bother me, and I just found that there are very few people that I could talk to about them. And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
over time, a lot of these things, I took notes, I started writing a lot about it, but I never shared with anyone. So I found just recently, I said, you know what, I'm just gonna put this out there and talk about this, and hopefully there'll be people out there who respond to it. And
right.
this article actually got a lot more response than I thought it would, the Guardian article, and it's great that
Yeah, yeah.
that so many people responded to it, and that's how we connected here. I mean,
Right.
I saw
Yeah.
your
No.
post. I saw your post on Facebook, and I was like, oh, this. He would be a great person to talk to about this. So
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess it's a. I mean, there are some similarities. I'm not an immigrant, but obviously I have a mixture ethnic background,
uh-huh.
half Jamaican, half English. But I was born in England, and so I'm a composer, and I formerly worked as a senior lecturer in composition and music
Mm,
theory and applied harmony at one of Britain's leading rock and pop
mm,
schools. I worked prior to that, worked as a peripatetic instrumental tutor in
mm.
sort of several state schools in inner city areas in London. And I'm like you. I'm currently finishing my PhD at
Oh, that's
Oxford
great.
University. I submitted and in composition and critical writing,
Uh-huh.
and my background is I'm from I guess a working class background in an area of England called Bedfordshire originally, which is, for those who don't know, it's like the kind of the bum, the
Mm,
butt in the lower corner
I
of
see.
England, and it's about sort of 60 miles above London. And yeah, as you mentioned, we kind of connected. It's kind of great that this article, in a way, has bonded people,
Yeah,
I think.
yeah. That's
And so we met because of a Guardian article that was written by a journalist by the name of Charlotte Gill, and the article was entitled "Music and Education is now only for the white and wealthy." And I think that the article, for me at least, implied that that teaching of music notation in state schools to working class and minority students was somehow alienating, and that was the kind of implication.
mm,
And it kind of resulted in a huge backlash, culminating in a letter written by the British pianist Ian Pace,
yeah. Who I hope
and
to
the
get on.
composer.
Hopefully after this interview, he will want to join and talk about it too.
Yeah, I'm sure, and I'm sure that he'll have an awful lot to say.
Yeah,
And I think also the composer Joan Arnau Pàmies as well helped to draft the letter.
yeah,
And it quickly accompanied by about 650 or so signatures from sort of notable
yeah,
musicians, music practitioners, ex peripatetics,
yeah.
all kinds of people. I received a lot of responses as the result of this whole sort of email posting from parents who had previously kind of benefited from music provision, but who were now, now had children from working class areas who no longer were able to benefit
Hmm.
from that. And so lots of signatures basically placing pressure on the Guardian to publish Ian Pace's response.
Hmm.
I sort of sent them a letter along with many others as well, kind of urging them to print the response. And so that's I guess that's kind of how we sort of connected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you brought up a lot of points, and is there what did you find the most disturbing, or something you didn't like about the article? What was the main thing?
I think, I mean, first of all, I should say that I think I don't think that the article is specifically about the journalist, and that it's the Guardian article, I think, has become a catalyst for a renewed discussion on lots of the problems that music teachers working in the state sector have to deal with, and I think there are sort of several, but they're interconnected issues. And I think the first is, and this is funnily enough the one that everyone wholeheartedly agrees with, which is really just to do with the simple absence of funding for maintaining consistent instrumental teaching in school. Everyone agrees with that, I think. The second issue is a much more complicated issue, and I think that it's derived from the kind of intersect that the sort of post-colonial discourse that is specific, an issue specific to classical music, the impact that discourse has had in very real terms on the kind of education received by Black, Asian, minority ethnic students, and particularly those from working class backgrounds, and also as well white working class students from those backgrounds.
And I'm happy you said that, because that was going to be another point I make, is because we always think about the divide to be between race and races, but there's a lot of people out there who do come from Black families or minorities that have access and a lot of access to a lot of these things. So
it's become a very complex kind of intersect, and I think it's influenced not just music provision and education, but I think it's behind a lot of the kind of like global political discussions. I mean, both in the US and over here as well. And maybe we'll talk a bit more about that. And I think the third and sort of final issue for me, I think, was just generally kind of dispelling myths that are kind of propagated in both the media and also not great kind of pedagogical research, which people just kind of accept as sort of common sense. And I think a lot of that was sort of apparent in the article itself, which I think was also one of the reasons that led to the kind of concern and frustration, and I think in some cases anger from those either working directly in the state sector or FE or HE education, further and higher education, who see directly the negative effects, the cumulative effects that these kinds of statements have had on education policy in working class areas. So I think obviously the biggest problems, as I outlined in kind of my own diatribe post, was clearly state schools are these are issues caused by respective governments seeking these kind of cost neutral alternatives to music education, and the result of which is the complete decimation of instrumental teaching in schools. You as a musician, that instrumental lessons are necessary in order for children to learn how to play, and this isn't a classical issue, whether it's a bass guitar, whether it's a flute, a piccolo, and I think that while it's certainly true that classical music in state schools takes a definite hit under that problem of funding, I think that this particular issue is not specific to classical music. It's a problem for all musicians. And I think those of us who were sort of fortunate to kind of slip through the net from those backgrounds, and I think in my case it's the result of a postcode lottery. I have no idea how those today living in certain economically deprived inner city areas, for instance, would have access to instrumental playing, access to the kind of experience that I had. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about classical music, just playing. So I think it's not uncommon in certain state schools now for schools to just have sort of no provision for instrumental teaching at all. But also, very often, the only involvement that a state school will have in classical music, I think, is via, a 2-day workshop with Ensemble X that will come in and work with the students, which is, as you know, is absolutely no substitute for the weekly, regular, instrumental lessons and learning to play with other children in an ensemble. And so, the end result is that those areas, their musical experience becomes a sort of kind of vicarious backseat, participation. So, just to sort of finish up my diatribe on this, I think on the one hand you have a sort of a right-wing free market economy model that views instrumental teaching as a luxury that should be paid for, and therefore becomes the reserve of the very rich.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other, you have a liberal ideology that I think is derived from some really thoughtful post-colonial discourse, but ends up very quickly kind of becoming an education policy that basically seeks to eradicate classical music in working class and culturally diverse areas by actively, denying people in state schools the opportunity to participate, engage, and have a voice and, contribute to its future.
So what can we do as individuals, as musicians, as artists? I mean, is there anything we could do? We always talk about these things, and all of us contribute in a lot of ways. But I mean, where do we even start now? Where can we go? I mean, do you have any ideas about this?
I do. Yeah, I do. I mean, I think I think in this regard, it's perfectly reasonable to question the dominance of, let's say, Western European art music in state school in a multicultural society, sure, but mainly in terms of that it just makes sense to have a diverse, fruitful, enriching education experience that encompasses a range of different musical styles.
Of course.
I think that's a perfectly reasonable discussion to have, and it's one certainly in the UK, I don't know about across the pond, that has been going on for at least 30 years. Books like Lucy Green's How Popular Musicians Learn is 20 years old. Changes to both the GCSE and A-level syllabus with regards to the diversification of musical styles has been going on for 30 years. Yeah. And I think you have to remember that in this dialogue that education policies tend to be very sort of clunky, clumsy, overly reductive, creatures, very fragile, and so you have to be careful that when you highlight a concern for the dominance of Western art music in schools, that it doesn't just translate to black and brown children or white working class children being just flat out denied the opportunity to play the violin. So I think that what's happened as participation of the working class and minority students in classical music provision has diminished, this idea about diversifying musical styles in education in both the GCSE and A-level syllabus has had the unintended effect of increasing participation of middle class students into pop, as well as aspects of music of black origin. And I think this has been aided greatly by the rise of popular music degree courses and master's courses.
Especially in the UK. Especially in the UK. And I mean, from it was interesting to see a couple of years ago when I realized there was a master's degree in Beatles studies in UK at one of the colleges, and it's great. It's great to see that programs like this exist.
Right, and I absolutely agree. I mean, I should make it clear. I worked in a rock and pop school for a decade, and so my concern about this is definitely not an attack on popular music by any stretch of the imagination. I have no problem with middle class children participating in contemporary popular music, but I think as the participation of white middle class children in particular has increased, bear in mind that sort of many of those can still get access to private tuition and access to Western art music and lessons on the side. I think the options for working class children has in turn kind of diminished as a result of that. The combinations of the things that I've mentioned, the issues with funding, but also I think this issue of this conflation between diversification of musical styles automatically equals participation of that diversity. And so I think that combination has had the unintended effect of a kind of like a class-based artistic cultural gentrification where the middle classes have spilled over into territory previously occupied by working classes and minorities. And I think that's a fairly uncontroversial statement because Ironically, the Guardian newspaper itself has been reporting on this sort of phenomenon in the pop industry for years, and where artists in the pop industry have expressed their concern about the rise of middle class bands. And the decline of sort of the working classes in pop, whether it's the indie singer Tom Clark sort of criticizing bands that he considers to be aristocratic. Tom Bolton discusses this in his article, I think, Class War on the Dance Floor. Enemy features editor James McMahon, his criticism of bands like the Foals, and so. I mean, weirdly, I think it's sort of very similar to some of those concerns in the US about cultural appropriation of black culture in mainstream pop music. The examples would be, I don't know, Miley Cyrus and Katy Perry and Australian rapper Iggy Azalea for a few years ago sort of became kind of a poster child for, I think, those discussions on cultural appropriation. So I think my position is I'm all for the privately educated Etonian that wants to explore feminism in Nicki Minaj videos, and I say that sincerely. But I'm much more concerned about who's supporting the black female student from Hackney, who potentially could be the next Nicola Benedetti, or the Pakistani child from Bradford who wants to explore lyricism in Debussy preludes, the white working class kid from the Northeast, who's discovered his uncle's old Copeland CDs, or William Grant Still even, and has decided that he wants to be a composer, and so unless you're providing opportunities to make those provisions happen, then all you're really doing is sort of reducing the options already, towards those marginalized groups. So,
well, going back to something you said, you mentioned briefly improvisation, and that's something that's really lacking in classical music. I mean, I come from the classical music background. I have a hard time sometimes criticizing some of the things that happen, but simple thing like improvisation is not being taught in schools or in music conservatories even, and so this is a connecting point. If if all of us sort of had at least a basic understanding of an improvisation, at least might be a good way to connect the different cultures, to connect the different genres, because it's a tool that is very useful and helpful in connecting people. And I mean, what do you think? I mean, what's the reason why it's not being taught? Or maybe in the UK it's different, but in the United States, and I've been to quite a few colleges, it's definitely not part of the curriculum for the classical musicians.
I think it's really interesting. I think that this is also kind of an underlying discussion that I've had with sort of many musicians, and some of whom who really kind of responded quite negatively to Ian Pacey's original letter about the importance of notation, and I think sometimes that comes from a sort of very self-referential kind of personal position as a musician, where perhaps you didn't learn to read music, and so as the result, an endorsement of learning to read music in schools for some people becomes a kind of a sticking point where they interpret that to mean a kind of condemnation of improvisation skills, and so I think we have to work very closely together to try to be as articulate and to try to not throw shade on those individual skills. I think that certainly my position on the whole Gill article, I think would have been exactly the same if her position was implying that children shouldn't explore improvisation.
That's a very good point. I love that you said that. That's really great.
And I think that's a really important point. And in a way, that's got a little bit, I think, kind of lost in the debate. So it's kind of interesting. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, it's that notation isn't the only thing that should be taught in schools, and I hope that message is very clear.
Yeah. And what do we expect? I mean, we got some prominent names that responded to that article, but What do we expect from prominent names as musicians? What should we expect from them? What's their duty in reaching out and helping these programs be more stable? You know, classical music or music in general in schools, or just music education in general, wherever it might be. What do we expect from prominent names? Because prominent names, sometimes some of
Right.
these famous people don't famous artists they don't consider themselves educators, or they don't think
Right.
that they
Right.
could be good at it. But what can they do?
I think with respect to the names within the classical industry, I think what I would say is that I think in this regard there has been sort of the classical industry has had kind of historically some sort of major PR problems with respect to this particular sticking point of provisions in those areas, because I think historically the debate has just been framed in terms usually of the asserting the importance of retaining traditions, which I think in this day and age it's not really it's a sort of disastrous strategy, I think.
Yeah.
Or alternatively doing a kind of kung fu maneuver that emphasizes the kind of enriching aspects of classical music, but that doesn't actually deal with head on with the sort of very legitimate concerns that some people might have about only learning about old dead white guys. And so I think that's a problem, for classical music, not just because of the alienation that not addressing that ensues, but I think also as the result of this radical transformation that's occurred under the feet of classical music in both society and culture. Whereas I think the debate for those names, to answer your question, they should really be asserting, I think, very, very clearly the importance of ensuring that working class children have exactly the same opportunity to engage in the entire spectrum, which includes classical music. And sort of weirdly, and I guess perhaps kind of naively, I've always believed that minorities and working classes are kind of the key to the salvation of classical music's future, definitely in education. I mean, there was a published a letter in response to Gill's article quite shortly afterwards that that wasn't the Pace article, that was basically a sort of a kind of a puff piece from an ensemble, that will remain nameless. But I just thought that it was one of those missed opportunities, incredibly cynical, self-serving, act of publicity that really failed to address those issues within, Gill's article. And it was again this emphasizing, the enriching experiences. And I think that was why I was so keen for Ian Pace's letter to be published, because it did at least address some of those issues head on, which, as you know, resulted in fantastic response from names like, Simon Rattle,
yeah, of course,
Scottish composer James Macmillan, Michael Nyman, James Galway, I think.
Yeah, James Galway was on there, and James Galway
Joan,
is another person who is a very inspirational figure for me, because I actually, as a young flutist, I had a chance to. Wow. I had a chance to play with him on stage at Hollywood Bowl in LA. So,
oh man, that's amazing. Yeah.
So and he's always such a great figure. And again, as classical musicians, we always find things to complain about. I don't know if you know much about James Galway's background, but there's just so many flutists out there who complain about the fact that he's tried other genres and he's gone into playing other styles of music, and so we have a lot of people complaining. So it's crazy. This battle is endless, and people always find ways to argue for or against something. The man tries to do some folk music or rock or pop, whatever he's tried throughout his career, and it's actually benefited a lot. But people find ways to complain about it. So I just.
Well, I think go on. Sorry.
No, go ahead. That's all.
I agree with you. I think definitely that you have to avoid throwing kind of any shade on other genres, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I don't know. This has been great, Des.
Cool.
Do you wanna say some things about your research? Maybe we talked so much about other people and other recent article. We didn't get to you.
Nah, not really. My research. So I obviously studied composition and critical writing, which is a part portfolio, part musicology, thesis submission. And so my research was looking at Olivier Messiaen, the French composer's, some of his music, and looking at aspects of cultural appropriation of some of his kind of non-Western elements, and sort of using that idea of cultural appropriation as a means of analysis. So not necessarily as a means of judgment, but perhaps using the ethical aspects of that as a means of kind of understanding, his mindset, I guess, in his composition process in certain works. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing at the moment.
Well, thanks a lot, Des. I really appreciate it. Do you have anything else to say? I think this is a good place to stop. You had a lot of great points, and I really enjoyed talking to you.
No, that's fine. That's it. If you're happy, I'm happy to stop. It's fine.
It's great to do these talks, but sometimes I've realized they go way too long, and I don't know if the listener would appreciate that sometimes. But no, it's been great, and hopefully we could get you back to talk about more things and maybe some things outside of just this article.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, that sounds really good. That would definitely be my pleasure.